in the quiet charm of St. Mary Mead, where nothing dangerous ever truly happens. A strange incident unsettles the entire village. A perfectly polite resident suddenly becomes defensively hostile over a seemingly trivial matter. Yet Miss Marple notices what others don't. Why would someone hide a harmless object? Why lie about where they were? And why do their stories crumble under the simplest questions? As gossip spreads and secrets unravel, Miss Marple realizes this isn't about bad manners. It's about fear. And fear, she knows, always points toward a hidden truth, one someone in St. Mary Mead is desperate to protect. Chapter 1. A peculiar outburst at the vicarage tea. The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of St. Mary Mead, casting a warm, honey-colored glow across the village green. It was the sort of day that made one believe nothing troublesome could ever take root in such a peaceful corner of England. The birds chirped industriously from the hedges. The milkman rattled his bottles with an almost cheerful rhythm. And somewhere in the distance, someone was clipping rose bushes with neat, decisive snips. All appeared tranquil, comfortably, delightfully ordinary, which, as Miss Marple often remarked, was precisely the kind of day when the most curious things tended to happen. That Thursday, the vicarage was hosting its monthly ladies' tea, an event much beloved by those who enjoyed cakes, conversation, and the occasional harmless gossip. Miss Marple, neatly dressed in a soft lavender cardigan and a hat trimmed with modest ribbon, walked up the gravel path with her usual unhurried grace. Her eyes, bright and endlessly observant, took in every detail. The freshly swept porch, the slightly askew flower pot that someone had hurriedly righted, a loose thread on Mrs. Hartwell's coat, and the flutter of nervous energy from Mrs. Lestrange, who stood by the doorway smoothing her gloves far too frequently. Inside the vicarage, the dining table was laid out handsomely with lemon tarts, currant scones, Victoria sponge, and neat rows of cucumber sandwiches, all prepared with the delicate precision expected of Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife. The room hummed gently with chatter, the rustle of skirts, the soft clink of teacups, and the pleasant aroma of Earl Grey filling the air. Miss Marple had just accepted a plate from young Alice Clement when the door swung open rather abruptly, causing several ladies to turn. In stepped Mr. Edwin Bartlett, the quiet, bookish fellow who lived near the meadow lane. He was not a usual attendee of such gatherings, nor had anyone invited him. Yet there he stood, breathless, disheveled, and seemingly unaware of the startled stares fixed upon him. He clutched something small in his hand, wrapped in a handkerchief, which he tried unsuccessfully to hide behind his back. "My goodness, Mr. Bartlett," exclaimed Mrs. Clement with gentle alarm, "you gave us a fright. Is something the matter?" Mr. Bartlett's gaze darted anxiously from face to face as though searching for an escape route. No, nothing's the matter," he stammered, though his reddened complexion and twitching fingers suggested quite the opposite. "I only came to, well, never mind." His voice trailed off, and he made an awkward attempt to compose himself. Miss Marple watched him closely. She noted the slight tremor in his hands, the peculiar bulge of the wrapped object, and the way he stood half-turned toward the door as if prepared to make a quick retreat. She observed, too, that the soles of his shoes were muddied, as though he'd walked across the meadow despite the fact that the ground had been dry that morning. All of this, to her well-trained mind, presented a puzzle. A small puzzle, perhaps, but one worth observing carefully. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Then, to everyone's astonishment, Mrs. Hartwell, who had never once been seen raising her voice, stepped forward and confronted him sharply. "Edwin Bartlett," she said, her voice trembling yet unusually firm, "what are you hiding in that handkerchief?" Mr. Bartlett jerked his arm back defensively, backing into the corner like a startled cat. "Nothing. Nothing that concerns you," he snapped. "It's private, you hear? Private." A collective gasp fluttered through the room. Defensive behavior. Miss Marple noted it instantly. Not rudeness born of ill temper, but fear. Not the fear of being caught in wrongdoing, but the fear of discovery. She had seen it before in her own village, often in the most mundane circumstances. Young Tommy Preston, for instance, had once guarded a broken church window with such furious secrecy that one would have thought he'd stolen the crown jewels. People, she reflected, behaved defensively when they wished desperately to hide something that seemed trivial to others but monumental to themselves. Mrs. Hartwell drew back, startled by the sharpness of his tone. "Well, there's no need to shout," she murmured, though her eyes remained fastened on the mysterious object. Mr. Bartlett swallowed hard, then forced a strained smile. "Apologies, I'm not myself this morning." His voice wavered, betraying his nerves. "I only came because I thought Never mind." He clenched the wrapped handkerchief more tightly, almost fearfully. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. A sudden appearance, a concealed item, defensive behavior, contradictory denial, something was decidedly amiss. She leaned back slightly, not wishing to intrude yet making careful mental notes. The ladies resumed whispering behind gloved hands, and the previously warm atmosphere of the gathering shifted into one of curiosity tinged with unease. Mrs. Clement, ever the gracious hostess, attempted to recover the situation. "Well now, Mr. Bartlett, since you are here, do have a seat. A slice of sponge cake may I offer?" But her attempt at kindness only seemed to agitate him further. No, thank you, I haven't the time," he replied hastily. "I only came to return something." He glanced around the table, then quickly looked down. Something that was misplaced. "Misplaced?" repeated Mrs. Lestrange, arching an eyebrow. "What do you mean? Whose is it?" Mr. Bartlett opened his mouth, then shut it again. "I don't know," he muttered. "It doesn't matter." His fingers twitched nervously about the handkerchief. "It's nothing important." That, Miss Marple thought, was the most suspicious remark of all. No one arrived unexpectedly at a ladies' tea, flustered and behaving defensively simply to return an object of no importance. Also, there was the curious matter of it being misplaced yet unclaimed. People did not hide harmless items unless they feared what others might deduce from them. And fear, Miss Marple reminded herself, was often the biggest clue of all. Mrs. Hartwell was not satisfied. "Well, if it's something of the village, we ought to know, surely. There's no need for secrecy." Her tone was sharper now. She was not accustomed to being rebuffed. At that, Mr. Bartlett's posture stiffened. "Secrecy?" he echoed. "Why must everything be suspicion with you people? I'm merely doing the right thing." His voice cracked, his hands shaking with agitation. "You don't understand. None of you do." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. She saw a glimpse of the object beneath the cloth, just a corner, smooth, perhaps metallic, perhaps glass. But that fraction of a moment told her something important. It had weight, and it had significance. Mrs. Clement stepped toward him gently. "Mr. Bartlett, if you're in some sort of trouble—" "I'm not," he barked, far louder than appropriate. Several women flinched. Mrs. Lestrange dropped her teaspoon. "I'm not," he repeated more quietly, his breath shaky. "I only want to do the decent thing." "What decent thing?" Miss Marple asked softly, in the kind tone that suggested concern rather than interrogation. He looked at her, startled, as though he had forgotten she was there. For an instant his eyes softened, almost pleading. Miss Marple held his gaze steadily, kindly, the way one might look at a frightened child. "It's nothing," he whispered. "Please, I must go." And before anyone could stop him, he turned sharply, nearly knocking over a chair in his haste, and fled the vicarage. The door slammed behind him, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Mrs. Lestrange exhaled dramatically. "Well, If that wasn't the oddest thing I've ever witnessed. Positively rude, muttered Mrs. Hartwell, still visibly ruffled. Mrs. Clement shook her head. Poor man, something is weighing on him, surely. Miss Marple did not speak immediately. She considered the scene carefully. His abrupt entrance, the concealed object, the defensive outburst, and his insistence that he was doing the decent thing. There was also something else, something subtle mentioned almost in passing, yet it niggled at her. He claimed the object was misplaced, yet he refused to say whose it was. That alone was curious, but coupled with his fear. Yes, there was more to this than met the eye. She set down her teacup and folded her hands neatly in her lap. I do believe, dear ladies, she said quietly, that Mr. Bartlett is in some considerable distress. Mrs. Lestrange scoffed. Distress? He looked guilty, if you ask me. Oh, not guilt, Miss Marple replied calmly. Not precisely. No, I should say he is frightened. Terribly so. And people who are frightened often guard small things as though they were of immense consequence. And what do you suppose the item was? Mrs. Hartwell asked eagerly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled just slightly. Well, it was not large, and it glinted, which suggests metal or glass. A small tool, perhaps, or a piece of jewelry, or even a key. A key? Mrs. Hartwell's interest sharpened. But why hide a key? Miss Marple smiled faintly. That is what I should like to know. For the first time since the commotion began, excitement rippled through the ladies. A mystery, right here in their tranquil little village. Miss Marple remained thoughtful, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her saucer. She could not say what Mr. Bartlett was hiding, nor why he behaved so defensively. But she recognized the shape of trouble forming quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. It always began this way, with something small, something ordinary, something that did not fit. She knew with absolute certainty that whatever Mr. Bartlett carried in that handkerchief would soon ripple through the entire village, bringing with it secrets, whispers, and a truth someone was desperate to keep hidden. And Miss Marple, with her gentle manners and razor-sharp mind, found herself once again at the beginning of a mystery. Chapter 2. The Residence of St. Mary Mead. Whisper by the next morning, St. Mary Mead was humming with a kind of quiet excitement. The sort that begins innocently enough with a single curious incident and slowly gathers momentum as it passes from one doorstep to another. In any other place, it might have been considered impolite to dwell so much on another person's affairs. But in St. Mary Mead, where life was slow and news was scarce, a man storming into the vicarage and behaving defensively was quite the dramatic event. And so, long before the milk had settled on anyone's doorstep, the story of Mr. Edwin Bartlett's peculiar outburst had already traveled from the high street to the cottages near the woods. Miss Marple herself rose early, as she often did, and took her breakfast by the window overlooking her neat garden. The roses were in bloom, their petals curling delicately at the edges like the turning pages of a beautiful old book. She watched a sparrow hop across the lawn, pecking inquisitively at the soil. Everything appeared as tranquil as ever, and yet Miss Marple felt the familiar stirrings of curiosity, gentle but persistent. A mystery, no matter how small, had a way of settling in her mind like a seed waiting for the right conditions to sprout. She had scarcely finished her tea when she heard footsteps approaching along the garden path. The gate swung open, and in stepped Mrs. Price Ridley, wearing her usual air of self-importance and suspicion. A woman who thrived on propriety and the tiniest whiff of scandal. Her sharp-eyed gaze landed on Miss Marple with determination. "Good morning, Jane," she announced, barely allowing Miss Marple the chance to reply. "I do hope I'm not interrupting, but I simply had to speak with someone sensible about yesterday's business." Miss Marple smiled politely and gestured toward a chair. "Please sit, dear. You seem quite agitated. Agitated? Well, I should say so. Mrs. Price Ridley huffed as she lowered herself onto the seat. The whole village is abuzz, and rightly so. I have lived here 33 years and never, Jane, have I seen a man behave in such an inappropriate, secretive, and might I add, alarming manner. Miss Marple nodded gently. It was certainly unexpected. Unexpected? My dear, it was downright suspicious. Mrs. Price Ridley leaned forward conspiratorially. They say he was holding something wrapped up. Hiding it, in fact, something shiny, metal or glass. Yes, Miss Marple said calmly. I observed the same. And you think nothing of it? Mrs. Price Ridley gasped. Jane, really. You of all people, always noticing things the rest of us miss. Miss Marple placed her hands neatly in her lap. Oh, I noticed a great deal, I assure you. But one must be careful about drawing conclusions too quickly. A person may behave defensively for all sorts of reasons, some more innocent than others. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed dismissively. Well, I, for one, believe he's hiding something shameful. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And what makes you think that? Because I caught a glimpse of him near the old well last week, Mrs. Price Ridley said triumphantly. He was skulking about at dusk, poking at the stones as though searching for something. When I approached, he practically jumped out of his skin, nearly dropped his lantern. That is not the behavior of an innocent man, Jane. Miss Marple made a small humming sound. Curious indeed, but not yet incriminating. Mrs. Price Ridley looked almost disappointed. You're always so calm about these things. I'm certain there's something dreadful afoot. Mark my words. Miss Marple offered her a gentle smile. Perhaps, but Mr. Bartlett is simply not the sort of man one immediately imagines caught up in dreadful business. That, Mrs. Price Ridley declared dramatically, is precisely why it's so disturbing. They continued speaking for several minutes, but soon Mrs. Price Ridley took her leave, satisfied, at least for the moment, that she had sounded an appropriate alarm. Miss Marple watched her go with a thoughtful expression. There was nothing overtly sinister about Mr. Bartlett, nothing that pointed toward wrongdoing, but his sudden defensiveness, the concealed object, and now this peculiar business near the old well. Yes, something was not right. Later that morning, Miss Marple decided to take a stroll through the village. It was partly habit, partly enjoyment, and partly, if she was honest, an opportunity to observe how the mystery was settling into the daily rhythms of St. Mary Mead. For mysteries did not exist in isolation. They left traces in the places and people they touched. She had barely reached the high street when she encountered Mr. Summers, the grocer, who was arranging crates of apples near his doorway. His sleeves were rolled up and he wore a thoughtful frown. "Good day, Miss Marple," he greeted her, though his voice carried a distracted note. "Strange goings-on at the vicarage yesterday, I hear." Miss Marple paused beside him. Indeed, Mr. Bartlett made quite an unexpected appearance. Mr. Summers grunted. "That man's been odd for weeks, buying things he never bought before. Came in here the other day for gloves, heavy work gloves. Never seen him do a day's gardening in his life." "Did he say what he needed them for?" Miss Marple asked. "No, ma'am. Just said they were for private use." Seemed nervous even then. Miss Marple thanked him and moved on, her mind turning over this new piece of information. Gloves. A secretive visit to the well. A mysterious object he wished to return anonymously. Defensive behavior at the mere suggestion of questioning. The pieces were beginning to form a framework, but a framework for what? She passed the post office next, where Miss Hartnell stood sorting letters with a somewhat theatrical solemnity. The postmistress spotted Miss Marple and immediately leaned forward. "Jane, come here, quickly," she whispered urgently. You must know I saw Mr. Bartlett early this morning. He was hurrying toward the meadow path carrying a little tin box. Clutched it like treasure. Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. A tin box, you say? Yes. And he kept looking behind him as though afraid someone might follow. Miss Marple expressed polite surprise, though inwardly she felt a little shiver of interest. A handkerchief-wrapped item yesterday. A tin box today. Gloves purchased recently. A man behaving as though shadows pursued him. Something he wanted to return, but without anyone knowing. Yes, this was no trivial matter. She walked on, past cottages lined with hollyhocks, past the smithy, past the old stone bench where elderly Mr. Pritchard dozed in the sun. Bits of conversation drifted toward her from every direction. I heard he hasn't slept in days. Entered the vicarage like a man possessed. Something about the old well they say he's been digging, and he nearly attacked Mrs. Hartwell just for asking a question. Miss Marple listened politely when spoken to, asked a gentle question here and there, but never lingered too long. People spoke more freely when they didn't feel pressed. And in the span of one morning she had gathered enough small observations to fill several mental pages. Eventually she made her way toward Meadow Lane, a quiet, winding path lined with tall hedges and wildflowers. It led toward the meadow and beyond that, toward the old well. The well itself was no longer in use, of course. The village committee had declared it unsafe years ago, and it had since become something of a local relic. Children made up stories about it. Adults ignored it. No one had reason to go near it, except apparently Mr. Bartlett. Miss Marple walked with unhurried steps, enjoying the soft breeze and the distant sound of cattle in the fields. But as she approached the little bend near the old oak tree, she paused. Footprints. Several of them fresh, slightly irregular, pacing back and forth, and there, caught in the brambles near the path, was a torn piece of cloth, brown, coarse, and familiar. She picked it up delicately. It looked very much like the fabric of the coat Mr. Bartlett had worn yesterday. Now, she murmured softly. What were you doing here in such a state? She followed the footprints a little further until they branched off toward the old well. The grass was disturbed, the earth scuffed. Someone had knelt there recently, someone nervous, perhaps hurried. Miss Marple did not approach too closely. She merely observed, filed away details, and let the scene tell its quiet story. After a moment, she turned back toward the village. She had seen enough for now, enough to know that Mr. Bartlett was caught up in something he feared others discovering. Enough to know that whatever he wished to return was likely connected to this hidden activity at the well, and enough to suspect that he was not acting entirely alone or entirely voluntarily. By afternoon, the whispers of the village had grown into full conversations. People gathered in pairs and clusters outside their homes, their voices low but urgent. At the bakery, Miss Marple overheard, "I heard it's a weapon." "Nonsense, more likely a family heirloom." "At a ladies' tea, I doubt it." At the smithy, "He's been digging, I tell you, digging in the middle of the night." And near the green, "Someone ought to do something. Who knows what he's mixed up in?" Miss Marple strolled among them with polite smiles and quiet thoughts. She had always believed that mysteries often wove themselves through ordinary lives, hidden beneath the surface like threads in a tapestry. And the tapestry of St. Mary Mead was growing more intricate by the hour. Late that afternoon, as Miss Marple returned home, she saw a familiar figure hurrying past her gate. Mr. Bartlett. His shoulders were hunched, his coat buttoned unevenly, his face drawn and pale. He clutched the same tin box Miss Hartnell had mentioned, small, dented, and clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. He spotted Miss Marple and stopped abruptly. "Miss Marple," he said in a strained voice, "good day." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "Good day, Mr. Bartlett. You seem quite occupied." He nodded nervously. Just, just errands. I see. And how are you feeling after yesterday's frightful business? He winced. It was nothing, a misunderstanding. People assumed too much. People often do, Miss Marple replied kindly. But fear has a way of magnifying things, does it not? He stiffened. Fear? I don't know what you mean. Miss Marple tilted her head. I merely meant that when one is troubled, the smallest matter can seem overwhelming. Mr. Bartlett's breath quickened. I'm not troubled, he said too quickly. Nothing's wrong. Nothing at all. He clutched the tin box even tighter. Please, I must go. And he hurried off down the lane, nearly tripping over the uneven stones. Miss Marple watched him disappear, her expression soft but thoughtful. His behavior was not that of a guilty man, at least not in the criminal sense. No, this was something else, something tangled, fearful, and perhaps connected to matters far older than yesterday's tea. She stood there for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of village life. A dog barking, children laughing, a cart rolling over cobblestones, and beneath it all, the quiet, persistent sense that a mystery had settled over St. Mary Mead like soft fog. As she turned toward her house, she murmured to herself, Well, Jane, it seems we are only at the beginning. And indeed, she was right, for the whispers of the village were only growing louder, and the truth, whatever it was, had only just begun to reveal itself. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Meets the Key Suspects. The next morning dawned with a pale, pearly sky stretching softly over St. Mary Mead. A thin mist hovered above the fields, curling like breath against the hedgerows before slowly dissolving into cool autumn air. Miss Marple, bundled in a warm shawl, walked briskly toward the high street, intent on gathering information. Not by force, of course, but simply by placing herself where conversations naturally bloomed. It was remarkable what one could discover, she often mused, simply by seeming harmless and curious at the proper moments. Her first stop was the tiny bookshop run by the timid but observant Mr. Penworthy, one of the few villagers who interacted regularly with Mr. Bartlett. The bell above the door tinkled softly as Miss Marple entered. Inside, a faint scent of old paper and lavender polish met her, along with the quiet rustling of pages. Mr. Penworthy looked up from behind the counter, adjusting his spectacles with his habitual nervous gesture. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, offering a hesitant smile. "A pleasure as always. Looking for your weekly mystery novel, perhaps?" "Not today, Mr. Penworthy," Miss Marple replied warmly. "I found myself thinking about poor Mr. Bartlett. He seemed so terribly upset at the vicarage tea. Have you seen him recently?" Mr. Penworthy's eyes darted away. "Well, yes, I suppose I have. He was in here 2 days ago purchasing a field guide on local flora. Quite unusual now that you mention it. Mr. Bartlett is not the outdoorsy sort." "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured. "And did he seem himself?" "Well," Mr. Penworthy fidgeted. "He appeared anxious, looking over his shoulder, losing track of what he was saying. He even dropped a coin, quite unlike him." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "And did he say why he needed the guide?" "No. He said only that he was checking something important." Mr. Penworthy swallowed. "And when he left, I found a bit of mud on the counter, fresh mud. It struck me as odd." Miss Marple thanked him kindly and made a mental note. Mud, gloves, tools, a guide to plants, a tin box, a mysterious object wrapped in cloth, pieces of a puzzle still missing the center. As she stepped back onto the high street, the mist had thinned enough for the sun to warm the cobblestones. Shops were opening, villagers moving about with the quiet industriousness of a typical morning. Yet beneath the everyday routine, Miss Marple felt an undercurrent of tension, thin as a thread but unmistakable. Her next stop was the home of village newcomer Mrs. Clara Redmond, a young widow whose arrival 6 months earlier had stirred considerable interest. Pretty, soft-spoken, and fond of solitude, Mrs. Redmond had quickly become a favorite topic among the village ladies. Some praised her gentle manners, others found her aloofness suspicious. Miss Marple, however, believed she was simply private. Mrs. Redmond opened the door looking pale, as though she had not slept well. Her golden brown hair was pinned up hastily, and her eyes widened with genuine surprise. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you. Please come in out of the cold." Miss Marple stepped into the small sitting room, where a half-finished embroidery piece lay discarded on a table. Mrs. Redmond offered tea, but Miss Marple declined politely. She had no desire to prolong the visit beyond necessity. "I hope I'm not troubling you, my dear," Miss Marple began gently, "but I wondered if you had seen Mr. Bartlett recently." Mrs. Redmond's teacup clinked nervously against its saucer. "Mr. Bartlett? Why, yes, I saw him last week. He came by asking about some papers my late husband once kept. I didn't have them, of course. I told him so." "What sort of papers?" Miss Marple asked with feigned innocence. Mrs. Redmond hesitated. "He didn't say. He only seemed agitated, as though he wanted something desperately." "Did he mention why?" "No," Mrs. Redmond shook her head. "But when he left, I saw him stand outside my window for several minutes, pacing. He looked frightened." Miss Marple watched her carefully. Mrs. Redmond was telling the truth, but not all of it. There was something guarded in her eyes, something unsaid. Miss Marple decided not to press her. A gentle approach often yielded better results later. As she left Mrs. Redmond's cottage, she nearly bumped into Inspector Graves, the local police inspector, an earnest man in his 40s with stern eyebrows and a mustache that made him look both sensible and perpetually skeptical. He tipped his hat politely. "Morning, Miss Marple. Heard you've been asking around." Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "Oh, just curious. A village mystery is not something one encounters every day." The inspector sighed. "You're not wrong there. I had a visit from Mr. Bartlett this morning. He claimed someone had taken something from him, something important. Wouldn't say what." Miss Marple raised her eyebrows. "Taken? How troubling." "Yes, he was agitated, kept insisting the village wasn't safe, that he needed to return something before it became worse. Wouldn't explain anything. He seemed half out of his wits." "Poor man," Miss Marple said softly. "Fear can make the mind wander." The inspector grunted. "Fear or guilt?" Miss Marple's eyes sparkled. "Not always, Inspector. Sometimes simply fear." He gave her a long look. "If you know something, Miss Marple, I'd prefer if you didn't wait until trouble brews. You have a knack for seeing things others miss." Miss Marple chuckled lightly. "My dear Inspector, I only notice what anyone might notice, if they stop to look." Before the inspector could reply, a loud voice boomed from across the street. "Miss Marple, Inspector Graves, a word, if I may." They turned to see Colonel Weston, a retired military officer of considerable presence and opinion. The colonel was a sturdy man with a booming voice and a bristling white mustache that gave him the look of an indignant walrus. He marched across the road with dramatic purpose. "This business with Bartlett," he declared without preamble, "is absolute nonsense. The man's always been a nervous wreck. Probably just misplaced a button or something. The whole village is overreacting." Miss Marple gave him a kindly nod. "And yet, Colonel, Mr. Bartlett seemed quite sincere in his distress." "Distress?" the colonel scoffed. "He needs a holiday. Or a stiff drink." Inspector Graves frowned. "Colonel, did you see him yesterday?" "Yes," the colonel admitted reluctantly. He came by the club asking after an old map, something about boundary lines near the Okodzikitum meadow. I told him to ask the council. He muttered something about needing to check the well. Foolishness, if you ask me. Miss Marple's mind sharpened. The well again, a map, boundary lines. Why would Mr. Bartlett be interested in such things unless something near the well had significant meaning? As the colonel stomped off, grumbling about village hysteria, Miss Marple made a quiet list in her mind of the key people involved so far. Mr. Edwin Bartlett, fearful, secretive, connected somehow to the old well. Mrs. Clara Redmond, nervous, withholding something connected through her late husband's papers. Colonel Weston, dismissive but knowledgeable about maps and land boundaries. Mr. Penworthy almost observed unusual purchases and behavior. Inspector Graves, aware something is wrong but lacking direction. A puzzle indeed, and puzzles always required patience. Miss Marple continued her walk toward the meadow path, her steps light but purposeful. She was not surprised to find another villager lurking nearby. Miss Effie Whitcomb, a middle-aged woman of eager curiosity and very little subtlety. She stood near the hedgerow, feigning interest in a patch of wildflowers while clearly waiting for someone to talk to. "Oh, Miss Marple," Miss Whitcomb exclaimed when she spotted her. "I didn't see you there." "Good morning, Miss Whitcomb," Miss Marple said gently. "Are you enjoying the flowers?" Miss Whitcomb waved a hand. "Oh, yes, lovely things, but between you and me, I was actually hoping to catch a glimpse of Mr. Bartlett. People say he's been skulking around here again." "Have they?" Miss Marple asked softly. "And have you seen anything unusual yourself?" Miss Whitcomb brightened immediately. "As a matter of fact, I have. Last evening, just before dusk, I saw someone walking toward the well. Couldn't see clearly from this distance, but I'm almost certain it was Mr. Bartlett. He was carrying a lantern." "A lantern?" Miss Marple repeated. "Yes, and something else, something small. He kept glancing about as if afraid of being followed." Miss Marple's mind raced. Not outwardly, of course. Outwardly, she remained serene. A lantern at dusk, a small object, private visits to the well. And fear. Always fear. She left Miss Whitcomb with pleasant thanks and continued down the path until the village noise faded behind her. Meadow Lane stretched peacefully ahead, lined with tall grass and dotted with wildflowers trembling lightly in the breeze. It was quiet except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the soft rustle of leaves. Near the bend she spotted movement. Someone crouched near the hedgerow. As she approached quietly, the figure straightened. Mr. Lionel Graves, Inspector Graves' younger cousin, recently arrived in St. Mary Mead to assist at the police station. A polite, intelligent young man, though not nearly as seasoned as his cousin. "Miss Marple," he said with a blush, "I didn't expect to see you here." "Nor I you, Mr. Lionel," Miss Marple replied. "Are you assisting your cousin?" He hesitated, then nodded. "In a way. He asked me to check the path near the well. There have been reports of disturbances here." "Quite a number, it seems," Miss Marple murmured. "Have you found anything?" "A bit of disturbed soil, footprints, and, well, this." He held out a small scrap of parchment. It was torn, stained with dirt, and barely legible. Miss Marple examined it carefully. It bore the faint outline of a hand-drawn shape, arched like a stone, perhaps, and markings that looked almost like numbers, coordinates, measurements, or something older. "Where did you find this?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Near the well," Lionel said, and caught on a bush. Miss Marple handed it back with a serene smile masking her racing thoughts. "Thank you, Mr. Lionel. You have been most helpful." As he walked off, Miss Marple remained still for a moment, listening to the rustle of grass and the quiet hum of the countryside. She was beginning to see the shape of the puzzle, even if the picture was not yet complete. Mr. Bartlett was not simply frightened. He was involved in something hidden, something that had drawn in others, some knowingly, some unknowingly, something connected to the old well, something worth guarding fiercely. Miss Marple turned toward the path back home, her steps slow and thoughtful. She now had her suspects, not necessarily culprits, but key players in the unfolding mystery, and she knew that each one held a fragment of the truth. As she walked, she murmured softly to herself, a habit formed long ago. People rarely hide things without reason, and fears like secrets tend to ripen in the dark. The sun dipped behind a cloud, casting a faint shadow across the lane. Miss Marple lifted her gaze. The mystery had begun to take shape, and soon, very soon, the truth would begin to emerge. Chapter 4. A Curious Object and a Contradictory Story. The following afternoon brought a gentle warmth to St. Mary Mead, the kind that made the village lanes glow honey gold and encouraged even the most reclusive residents to wander outside. Yet despite the idyllic sunshine, Miss Marple's mind remained firmly tethered to the peculiar events of the vicarage tea. She had seen enough unusual behavior over the course of her long life to recognize when something was amiss, and Mr. Collins's defensive outburst still clung to her thoughts like burrs on a gardener's glove. She took a slow, thoughtful walk down Old Mill Lane, her knitting bag swinging gently in her hand. Though she appeared as placid as ever, her eyes missed nothing: the fresh bicycle tracks near Mrs. Price Ridley's gate, the smudge of soot on the side of Colonel Halston's coat as he hurried past, even the faint impression of a boot heel near the path leading to Mr. Collins's cottage. The last one especially interested her. She paused, stooping delicately, much like a bird pecking at seed, to examine the soil. It was still soft from the previous night's rain, and the boot print was fresh, larger than Collins's own shoes. Someone had visited him early this morning. Miss Marple filed this away without comment and continued her walk. She didn't need to knock at Mr. Collins's door. She knew very well he'd be walking the village at this hour, attempting to restore his image after yesterday's unfortunate outburst. It would be far easier to observe him naturally. She found him precisely where she expected, standing rather stiffly near the greengrocer's, pretending to inspect a row of cabbages. He brightened at her approach, though the brightness wavered slightly, much like a gas lamp flickering in a draught. "Miss Marple, lovely afternoon, isn't it?" "Quite," she agreed pleasantly. "And how fortunate you are. Mrs. Owen tells me she sold you the last of her gooseberries this morning." "You must have risen very early indeed." There was the smallest pause, barely half a second. But Miss Marple noticed it with the precision of a pocket watch. "Ah, yes, well, I was up for a walk. Clears the mind, you know." He tugged at his collar. "And I do enjoy gooseberries." "Most refreshing," she said with a gentle smile. "And quite impressive to arrive before the cottage door was even opened." This time the pause stretched longer. His mouth opened, then shut, as though he were trying to decide between 3 different excuses and found none suitable. "Perhaps Mrs. Owen misremembered," he said finally, though his forced laugh made it clear he did not believe the statement himself. "I do find," Miss Marple replied lightly, "that people who run small shops rarely misremember who knocks before breakfast." Color crept into Mr. Collins's cheeks. Miss Marple let him stew no further. She had no intention of trapping him publicly. Instead, she shifted the conversation to something harmless. Petunias, of all things. And within 2 minutes, Mr. Collins had relaxed. But the tension in his shoulders had not escaped her. He was hiding something. Not out of wickedness, she suspected, but fear. She continued her stroll, her mind drifting as easily as the breeze. Something about his reaction connected neatly with the curious object she had glimpsed the day before, though only for the briefest instant. She had scarcely mentioned it to anyone, not even the vicar's wife, It was far too early for speculation, and Miss Marple prided herself on dealing in facts, not dramatic leaps. Still, she could not forget it. It had been lying beneath Collins's chair at the vicarage, a thin metal fragment, oddly shaped and rather out of place amid tea cakes and embroidered cushions. She would have picked it up herself had Collins not lunged toward it the moment her gaze dropped. The way he had snatched it, oh, far too quickly for comfort, told her the object was no mere trifle. And then there was the contradiction. He had claimed it was nothing, a broken piece of a pen. But Miss Marple had lived long enough to recognize metal fittings from certain containers designed to hold something quite specific and quite secret. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of brisk footsteps behind her. Turning slightly, she found herself face to face with Mrs. Aldridge, the new resident at the edge of the village, an intelligent woman with a crisp manner and a fondness for long coats even in warm weather. "Oh, Miss Marple, I've been meaning to speak with you," Mrs. Aldridge said, pushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Have you, by any chance, seen Mr. Collins today? He came to my cottage this morning looking for something he believed I borrowed. Quite an odd accusation." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted just a little. "Yes, some sort of container. He was terribly vague about it. Became rather defensive when I asked what it looked like." Miss Marple gave a soft, understanding nod. "Some people become defensive when they themselves aren't entirely sure what they are searching for." Mrs. Aldridge seemed to ponder this. "I suppose so. Still, his manner was rather frantic. He even knocked over one of my garden pots while looking through my shed." "Did he?" Miss Marple asked gently. "How curious, especially since he told Mrs. Owen he'd spent the entire morning walking near the mill." And there it was, the contradiction she had been waiting for. A neat little knot in the tapestry of truth just begging to be teased apart. After parting ways with Mrs. Aldridge, Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage, her expression thoughtful. Inside, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Grimsley, welcomed her with warm enthusiasm. "Miss Marple, do sit down. Would you care for some rosehip tea?" "Just a half cup, thank you," Miss Marple replied, settling into the familiar worn armchair near the window. She took a slow sip before asking, "My dear, did you happen to notice anything else unusual about Mr. Collins during yesterday's gathering?" Mrs. Grimsley's brow furrowed. "Now that you mention it, yes. After that strange outburst, he asked if he might use the study for a moment. Something about checking a note he left, though he emerged without anything in his hands." "But he was in the study?" "Yes, only a minute or two." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, the spoon tapping the side of the cup in a quiet, rhythmic pattern. The study. Of course, that room, filled with the vicar's bookcases and wooden cabinets, was precisely where she had first noticed the object rolling beneath Collins's chair. If he had briefly returned in hopes of retrieving whatever he'd dropped, well, that opened the door to several interesting possibilities, and one very troubling one. Miss Marple rose with a polite smile. "Thank you, dear. You've been tremendously helpful." "Oh? With what?" "With reminding me," she replied softly, "that sometimes the smallest dropped object can reveal the largest untold story." As she walked out into the bright afternoon, she felt the unmistakable tightening of a puzzle drawing itself together. A curious object, a defensive man, a contradiction in his morning activities, someone else's boot print outside his cottage, and a frantic search for a container he did not wish to describe. Piece by piece, the truth was forming. Miss Marple tightened her grip on her knitting bag. It was time, she thought, to have a closer look at the vicar's study. Chapter 5. Defensive Words, Nervous Eyes. The next morning dawned with a soft, pearl-gray mist settling over St. Mary Mead, blurring the hedgerows and lending the village a quiet, secretive feel. Such weather, Miss Marple reflected, often suited the mood of an unfolding mystery. People behaved differently in the mist. They walked more carefully, spoke more softly, and revealed more than they intended. And today, she sensed, would be one of those days. After finishing her modest breakfast of porridge and tea, Miss Marple wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The air was cool, fresh, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and chimney smoke. She walked with deliberate slowness toward the vicarage, her mind busy sorting the threads of the puzzle that had begun to reveal itself. She arrived to find the vicar himself, Reverend Grimsley, standing outside, sweeping the front path with an absent-minded vigor. His spectacles were fogged, his sleeves rolled up, and he looked entirely unlike the calm, dignified man he usually presented to the village. "Good morning, Reverend," Miss Marple said, stopping just short of the step. He startled slightly, then smiled. "Ah, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. Terrible business, this mist. Makes everything look rather ghostly." "Quite charming, I think," she replied pleasantly, "if one chooses the right spectacles." He chuckled but seemed distracted. Miss Marple noticed him glance toward the study window more than once. The nervous flick of his eyes did not go unnoticed. "I wonder," she said gently, "whether you might allow me another brief look inside your study. I believe I may have dropped something yesterday." The vicar hesitated just a moment too long. "Oh, well, of course, yes, though the room is a bit in disarray this morning." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "A little disarray can be very revealing." They entered the vicarage, and she felt immediately the quiet tension that hung in the air. Mrs. Grimsley must have already gone to town, for the house was unusually silent. The vicar hovered behind Miss Marple as she stepped into the study, wringing his hands. The room looked unchanged at first glance, books neatly shelved, maps rolled and tied with twine, papers stacked in modest piles. But Miss Marple noticed something new. A faint streak of dirt across the braided rug leading from the door toward the desk. Someone had been in here earlier. Someone who had not bothered to wipe their boots. She moved casually to the desk, her fingers lightly touching the edge. "I do admire how tidy you keep everything, Reverend." "Oh? Yes, thank you, I try," he said, voice a touch too bright. She turned, studying his expression with gentle curiosity. "Is something troubling you? You seem unsettled." His hand stilled. "It's nothing, really. Just a misunderstanding." "Those are often the most interesting sorts of things," she replied warmly. He hesitated again, swallowing hard. "It's Collins," he finally confessed. "He came first thing this morning before breakfast, asking if he could search the study again. He insisted he'd dropped something very important." "And did he find it?" "No," the vicar said, wiping his glasses. "But he became quite upset, accused me of moving it. Then he left in a terrible state." Miss Marple considered this, eyes drifting toward the faint dirt streak again. "Would you say he seemed afraid?" she asked softly. The vicar blinked. "Afraid? Well, yes, I suppose." His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing out the window as though expecting someone to follow him. "Quite interesting," she murmured. "Fear often explains defensive behavior better than guilt does." The vicar looked both puzzled and relieved, as though grateful someone else was finally acknowledging the oddity of Collins's actions. Miss Marple spent another few minutes in the study, scanning the floor, the desk, and the small table by the fireplace. She found no metal fragment, no sign of the dropped object, but she had never expected to find it here today. Collins had returned to look for it, which meant he believed it had remained in the room after his previous visit. And yet, it was no longer here. Someone else had taken it. Miss Marple thanked the vicar and stepped outside, letting the door close quietly behind her. She tapped her walking stick lightly on the path, a habit she used when thinking deeply. Something was shifting in the village, a tremor beneath its calm surface. She decided to walk to the high street. Mist curled around the hedges like pale fingers. Village life moved at its usual pace. Mrs. Price Ridley marched by with purposeful steps. Young Tommy Barker darted across the lane with a bundle of firewood, and Mrs. Aldridge stood outside the post office, reading a letter with a troubled expression. Miss Marple approached her gently. A rather serious look for such a lovely morning. Mrs. Aldridge folded the letter quickly, attempting to smile. "Oh, it's nothing, just family matters." "Family matters often leave people more flustered than criminal ones," Miss Marple said kindly. "I do hope it isn't distressing." "Well," Mrs. Aldridge hesitated, then sighed. "Mr. Collins came to see me again. He insisted I had taken something from him, or perhaps that I had seen someone else take it. He looked terribly frightened." "Did he say what this something was?" "No, but he kept muttering about a container and how it mustn't fall into the wrong hands." She lowered her voice. "Miss Marple, I know Collins is usually quite mild-mannered, but today he seemed on the verge of panic." "Fear," Miss Marple said softly, "makes people behave in all sorts of unexpected ways, defensive ways. It is rarely about the object itself, but what it reveals." Mrs. Aldridge looked confused but nodded cautiously. "Do you think he's in danger?" Miss Marple gave a small, thoughtful smile. "I think," she said gently, "that he believes he is." She walked on, her mind knitting the clues together. The metal fragment, the contradictory story, the frantic search, the early morning visitor, the vicar's unease, and now Mrs. Aldridge's confession. It was becoming quite clear that the object Collins had dropped and the container it belonged to held some significance far beyond simple personal value. And someone else in St. Mary Mead knew exactly what that significance was. Miss Marple paused at the corner of the lane leading to Collins's cottage. The mist was lifting, sunlight beginning to seep through. Somewhere in that cottage, she suspected, lay the heart of the matter. Hidden fear, nervous eyes, and the strange defensive behavior of a man who knew far more than he dared admit. And she fully intended to uncover the truth. Chapter 6: False Leads Among the Rose Gardens. By the following afternoon, the mist had lifted from St. Mary Mead, replaced by clear sunshine that made every rose bush in the village glow like a jeweled patchwork of reds, pinks, and soft apricots. To the casual observer, all seemed peaceful. Women trimmed hedges, gardeners hummed as they raked soil, and the postman whistled cheerfully as he made his rounds. Yet beneath the loveliness, a quiet ribbon of tension wound through the lanes as if the village itself held its breath. Miss Marple sensed it in every hesitant greeting and every too casual smile. She made her way along the garden path beside Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, a delightful stretch lined with rose arches that formed a fragrant corridor of blossoms. Though she appeared simply to be admiring the blooms, as any elderly lady might, her mind was nowhere near the flowers. She replayed the events of the past 48 hours with meticulous precision. Collins's fearful eyes, his frantic search for the missing container, the contradictory stories about where he'd been, the dirt in the vicar's study, and Mrs. Aldridge's uneasy encounter with him all pointed towards something more elaborate than mere personal distress. At the far end of the garden, Miss Marple recognized the tall, narrow figure of Colonel Halston, leaning over a rose bush with pruning shears in hand. His face brightened when he saw her approach. "Miss Marple? Out for your afternoon constitutional?" "Indeed," she replied, examining a pale tea rose. "Though I must say, Colonel, your roses are looking particularly vigorous this season." Halston puffed proudly. "Nurtured with military discipline, my dear lady. Plants respond well to structure." Miss Marple smiled softly. And people, Colonel? Do they also respond well to structure? He blinked in surprise. People? Well, some do, I suppose. Others resist it. Especially when under pressure, she murmured. The Colonel shifted slightly, his shears pausing mid-air. Miss Marple observed the faintest shadow cross his features, an unease tucked just beneath his practiced stoicism. Colonel, she continued gently, I wonder if you have happened to see Mr. Collins today. He seemed most unsettled yesterday. He came this morning, Halston admitted, lowering his voice. Asked whether I'd noticed anyone lurking near his cottage at dawn. And had you? No, he said, then scratched his chin. Though I did see someone walking toward the vicarage earlier, tall fellow wearing a dark coat. Couldn't make out much in the dim light. And you say walking toward the vicarage? Yes. Not toward Collins's cottage. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. This differed from what she had suspected. A false lead, perhaps, but false leads, she knew, often revealed more than they concealed. She thanked the Colonel and continued toward the village green. Children played hopscotch near the well, their laughter ringing like bells in the warm air. Yet even as she watched them, her mind lingered on the tall figure in a dark coat. There were at least 3 men in the village who fit that vague description, and 2 women who sometimes donned long coats for morning walks. Miss Marple tucked the detail away as she neared the churchyard. There she found Mrs. Price Ridley directing a hired gardener with her usual air of authority. At the sight of Miss Marple, she adjusted her hat and approached briskly. My dear Miss Marple, she said in her clipped tone, I do hope you aren't involving yourself in this ridiculous fuss about Collins. Fuss? Miss Marple repeated pleasantly. Yes, he's been darting about like a startled hen, bothering respectable people with questions. Asking me, of all people, whether I had seen a tin container in the churchyard. I told him I certainly had not. Did he seem distressed? Distracted, she conceded. Rather pale, and he kept glancing over his shoulder. Miss Marple let the silence stretch just long enough for the woman to fill it, which she obligingly did. And between us, Miss Marple, Mrs. Price Ridley added, lowering her voice, I believe he's hiding something unsavory. A man doesn't behave that way unless he's tangled. Himself in trouble. Miss Marple smiled politely. One never knows, dear. Sometimes the simplest explanation is fear, not wrongdoing. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. Fear is only useful when warning one of danger. And perhaps it is doing precisely that, Miss Marple said softly. She left the churchyard and followed the narrow footpath leading toward the far rose gardens beyond the village hall. As she walked, she noticed a small figure crouched near the hedgerow. It was young Emily Carter, the schoolteacher's niece, gathering fallen petals in her apron. Miss Marple approached with her usual gentle kindness. Good afternoon, Emily. Collecting treasures? The girl nodded shyly. Auntie says we can press them for my scrapbook. How lovely. Tell me, dear, did you see anyone passing through here early this morning? Someone who might have seemed in a hurry? Emily thought for a moment. I saw Mr. Collins, she said finally. He was talking to someone behind the hall, but I couldn't see who. They were whispering. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Whispering, you say? Yes. And Mr. Collins dropped something. I think it made a little clink sound when it hit the ground. A metal sound, just like the fragment she'd seen. And what happened then? Miss Marple asked gently. He picked it up very quickly and looked scared. Then he walked away fast. Miss Marple thanked her warmly. Children noticed far more than adults gave them credit for, and Emily's observation fitted neatly into the growing pattern. Collins was meeting someone secretly and dropping parts of the mysterious object more than once. She made her way to a bench near the rose arbor and sat down, taking out her knitting as if merely resting. But her mind was humming. The false leads she encountered today, Colonel Halston's citing of the wrong direction, Mrs. Price Ridley's disdainful accusations, and Emily's vague, whispering companion, all contributed threads to the growing tapestry. False leads, she knew, were rarely wrong. They were simply incomplete. Someone had visited Collins's cottage at dawn. Someone had spoken with him behind the village hall. Someone had taken the missing container. And someone had been inside the vicarage study, leaving a trail of dirt. Miss Marple knitted 2 rows with steady hands. There was only one conclusion she could draw, and though she did not yet have proof, she felt it forming with quiet certainty. The person involved was not panicked. It was calculated. Someone in St. Mary Mead was moving with careful intention, using Collins's fear as a shield for their own purpose. And Miss Marple had just begun to uncover which of the village's calm, polite faces hid that intention. Chapter 7. The Shadow in the Corner. The storm pressed against the old mansion like a living creature, howling through the corridors as Noah stood frozen in the dimly lit library. The moment he stepped inside, he felt something shift. Air thickening, silence deepening, as if the room itself had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. He raised his flashlight, its beam slicing through swirling dust motes, revealing shelves of ancient books whose spines were cracked with age. A faint scent of damp wood and forgotten secrets lingered in the air. But what unsettled him most was the sense that he was not alone. A presence, cold, patient, and unseen, seemed to crouch in the farthest corner, waiting. Noah's fingers tightened around his flashlight. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots with every cautious step. He scanned the room again, moving the beam slowly across walls lined with portraits. Faces of long-dead family members whose painted eyes followed him with uncanny familiarity. One portrait showed a stern man with sharp cheekbones and hollow eyes. Noah had seen that same face before, in the journal entries belonging to Evelyn's missing brother, Victor. The discovery sent a chill crawling up his spine. If Victor had been here, if he had studied these very books, what exactly had he uncovered before he vanished? The library window suddenly rattled violently, making Noah flinch. Rain hammered the glass as wind roared outside, shaking the large trees whose shadows danced across the walls like restless spirits. Noah took a step closer to the window, and then he saw it. In the reflection behind him stood a dark figure in the corner. His breath caught. He spun around instantly, raising his flashlight like a shield. But the corner was empty. No figure, no movement, only darkness whispering back at him. His pulse thundered. He wasn't imagining things, he knew what he saw. Or maybe the mansion was getting into his head the same way it had gotten into Victor's. Trying to steady himself, Noah approached the corner cautiously. The wooden floor felt colder here, and the air carried a faint metallic scent like dried blood. He crouched, brushing his hand against the floor, and felt a groove. A long one, carved intentionally into the wood. He followed its path until he found more, symbols etched into the floorboards, faint but unmistakable. The same symbols he had seen in Victor's notes. It wasn't random. Victor had been trying to send a message, or a warning. Noah exhaled sharply, realizing that whatever had started consuming this family had begun long before he arrived. Suddenly, a subtle thump echoed from behind one of the shelves. Noah shot to his feet, the sound repeated, slow, rhythmic, almost like knocking. The shelf trembled slightly, dust falling in thin streams. Noah stepped back, instinct telling him not to get any closer, but curiosity tugged harder. He reached out and pressed his palm against the shelf. It shifted, not the whole shelf, a hidden panel. He pushed harder, and it slid open with a low groan, revealing a narrow passage that descended into darkness. Cold air wafted out, carrying the scent of stone and something deeper, older. For a moment, Noah simply stared. A secret passage inside the library. Victor must have discovered it, and now Noah had too. He inhaled, bracing himself, and stepped inside. The walls were lined with damp stone, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the narrow corridor. His flashlight beam flickered as if protesting the cold. The tunnel sloped downward, deeper into the mansion's underbelly, where secrets had been buried for decades. As Noah continued, he sensed that the shadows here were thicker, almost tangible, like they clung to the walls waiting for him to pass. Halfway through the passage, Noah paused. A whisper, soft, almost inaudible, brushed against his ear. He jerked around, shining his flashlight behind him. Nothing, only stillness. But he knew he heard something. He continued forward, footsteps heavy and careful, until he reached a small wooden door covered in dust and deep scratch marks, like someone had tried to claw their way out. Noah swallowed hard. He grasped the rusty handle and pulled. The door opened with a harsh scrape, revealing a hidden room no bigger than a closet. Inside, the air felt suffocating. Papers lay scattered everywhere. Pages torn from journals, sketches, and maps with strange markings. A lantern sat on the floor beside a broken chair. But what caught Noah's attention was the wall. It was covered in writing. Dozens of sentences carved into the stone with shaking hands. He stepped closer, reading the frantic words. "It sees me. It moves when I look away. The shadows are alive." And at the bottom, carved deeper than the rest, "Don't trust the coroner." Noah felt his stomach twist. Victor had been trapped in this room, or hiding. The fear was carved into every word. Noah lifted one of the loose papers and saw a sketch, a shadowy figure standing in a corner of a room. The same corner Noah had just seen the figure in. His hand trembled slightly. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't coincidence. Something truly lived within these walls, and Victor had seen it too. As Noah collected a few pages, the lantern on the floor flickered to life. Noah froze, breath caught in his throat. The flame danced shakily, though no one had touched it. The room dimmed, the temperature dropping sharply. Noah backed away slowly, keeping the lantern in sight, but his instincts screamed, "Run! Now!" Before he could move, the shadows on the wall stretched and warped, converging into the corner behind him. His heartbeat hammered painfully as he turned, flashlight trembling in his grip. A dark silhouette stood silently in the corner, its form barely visible yet heavy with presence. Noah stumbled backward, colliding with the stone wall. The shadow didn't move. It simply watched, observed, studied him. And then in a single blink it vanished, absorbed back into the darkness like it had never existed. The lantern went out instantly, plunging the room into suffocating black. Noah didn't wait. He bolted out of the narrow room, racing up the passage, heart pounding like a war drum. He burst back into the library, slamming the hidden panel shut behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps, sweat chilling on his skin. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the silence returned, heavy, watchful, oppressive. Noah leaned against the bookshelf, clutching the papers he had grabbed. Whatever Victor had discovered, whatever haunted this mansion, Noah had seen it, and it had seen him. Chapter 8. Pieces of the Puzzle. The morning sun had finally pierced the fog that had lingered over St. Mary Mead for days, casting a gentle golden light across the village rooftops. Birds sang softly in the hedgerows, and the distant clatter of carts on cobblestones created a rhythm to the village's waking life. Miss Marple, however, paid little attention to the idyllic scenery. Her mind was fully absorbed in the puzzle of Mr. Collins, the missing container, and the strange behavior she had observed over the past week. Every clue seemed to fit into a larger pattern, yet the final piece eluded her like a bird flitting just out of reach. She decided to begin her morning with a visit to the vicarage, hoping that Reverend Grimsley might recall a detail overlooked in the flurry of the past days. As she walked along the narrow lane, she noted every sound: the gentle hiss of leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant bark of a dog, and the faint clinking of metal coming from a nearby shed. Each noise, she knew, might conceal a secret or hint at a truth hidden in plain sight. The vicar greeted her warmly, leading her into the sitting room where the tea had been laid out for morning visitors. Miss Marple allowed herself a polite smile as she settled into the chair by the window. "Reverend," she began, "I have been reflecting on Mr. Collins's peculiar behavior. You mentioned that he believed something had been taken from him. Did he mention anyone else who might have had reason to be involved?" The vicar thought for a moment, adjusting his spectacles. "I suppose he did allude to someone visiting late at night, though he wouldn't name names." He seemed quite frightened. His eyes darted everywhere as though he expected someone to appear in the room at any moment. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with quiet understanding. Fear often reveals more than the object itself. It is curious, is it not, how the imagination can exaggerate or misplace a threat? "Yes," the vicar said slowly, "but he seemed certain that the missing item was of great importance, something that could cause significant consequences if misused." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, letting the words settle. She then asked a few discreet questions about the household routines and whether any visitors had been seen near the study or garden paths at unusual hours. Each answer provided tiny fragments, delicate threads that, once woven, together might form a coherent picture. After her visit, Miss Marple walked toward Collins's cottage, her mind focusing on the smaller, subtler details: the slight scuff on the threshold of the vicarage, the faint trace of mud on the lane leading to the greenhouse, and the rustle of leaves beneath the old oak where she had once glimpsed a shadow. Each clue was a stepping stone, a fragment of the larger story that remained obscured by layers of fear and secrecy. Reaching the cottage, she noticed that the door, usually tightly closed, was slightly ajar. Carefully, she stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of lavender polish mixed with the earthy scent of damp wood. Collins was nowhere to be seen, but the small writing desk in the corner drew her attention immediately. Papers were scattered across the surface, some bearing notes and sketches, others were mere scraps torn from a larger document. Among them, Miss Marple spotted a faint smudge, as if someone had tried to erase a word but had only partially succeeded. She picked up the paper and studied it. It appeared to be a map, a rough sketch of the village with several points marked in pencil. One point was the old well, another the library at the vicarage, and a third at the far end of the rose garden near Mrs. Weatherby's cottage. Each location had a small annotation, almost indecipherable: a letter, a number, a word or two. Clearly, Mr. Collins had been tracking something or someone, and the markings were intended to guide him or to warn of danger. Her examination was interrupted by a soft noise behind the curtains. Miss Marple turned slightly and saw a figure retreating quickly into the shadows of the hallway. Calmly she approached, noting the way the figure moved, deliberate yet cautious. It was obvious the person did not want to be seen, yet their presence alone confirmed what she had suspected. Mr. Collins's missing object was of interest to more than one person in the village. After a moment, the figure emerged. A young man, pale and visibly anxious, who introduced himself as Lionel Graves, cousin to Inspector Graves. He had been following a hunch, much like Miss Marple herself, and his discoveries intersected with hers. He spoke of a hidden compartment he had discovered in the rose garden fence, a tiny metal box containing folded notes, written in a hand Collins would recognize immediately. The notes spoke of secrecy, warnings and instructions to return the container to a specific location should anyone seek it with dishonest intentions. Miss Marple listened intently, her mind connecting the pieces. The container had been hidden, sought after, and protected with both fear and vigilance. Mr. Collins's defensive behavior, his frantic searches, and the contradictory statements he had made were now comprehensible. He had not been paranoid. He had been protecting something valuable, though not in a way the village could understand. Together, Miss Marple and Lionel examined the map once more. Each marking, when viewed in sequence, outlined a path, a cautious route that avoided observation, ensuring that only the person familiar with the notes could follow it safely. A pattern emerged. The path led from Collins's cottage to the vicarage, across the rose gardens, and finally to the old well at the edge of the meadow. Miss Marple realized with a quiet thrill that the well, previously dismissed as a trivial landmark, was the true focal point of the entire mystery. As they traced the route with careful fingers, Miss Marple's mind worked rapidly. Each person in the village who had interacted with Collins, each subtle glance or nervous movement, each unexplained presence in the rose garden, all made sense now. The mystery was no longer abstract. It had shape, direction, and purpose. Before leaving, Miss Marple paused by the window. Sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, illuminating the scattered papers. The faint scent of lavender mixed with damp earth reminded her of the village's comforting familiarity. And yet, beneath that comfort, danger had quietly slithered, unseen. She knew the coming hours would require precision, patience, and careful observation. The final pieces of the puzzle were within reach, and the true nature of Mr. Collins's fears would soon be revealed. Not in panic, but in clarity and careful explanation. As she stepped out into the warm sunlight once more, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The pieces were falling into place. The puzzle was no longer fragmented. The journey to uncover the truth, the path through fear, secrecy, and misdirection, was nearing its culmination. And when the final revelation came, the village of St. Mary Mead would understand that even the most ordinary of people, observed closely and patiently, could hold the keys to extraordinary mysteries. Chapter 9. The Revelation at Tea. The late afternoon sun cast long dappled shadows across St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple made her way toward the vicarage. The village was unusually quiet, as if it too sensed the tension that had been building over the past week. Every lane and hedge seemed pregnant with anticipation, waiting for the truth to emerge. Miss Marple's shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, though not for warmth. She preferred to carry her calm exterior like armor. Today she would bring the puzzle to its conclusion, drawing together the threads of mystery that had entwined the village, the vicarage, and most importantly, Mr. Collins. Upon entering the vicarage, she was greeted by the warm aroma of freshly brewed tea and the gentle hum of conversation from a handful of gathered villagers. Among them were Mrs. Grimsley, Colonel Halston, Mrs. Price Ridley, and even Mrs. Aldridge. Faces familiar yet now tinged with curiosity and subtle apprehension. At the center, near the window where the sun fell just so, sat Mr. Collins himself, fidgeting with a handkerchief and glancing nervously toward every visitor who arrived. His usual composure had been replaced by a tentative unease, and Miss Marple observed him carefully, noting how every nervous tick, every involuntary glance, spoke volumes about his state of mind. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice soft yet commanding, carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Thank you all for joining me. I believe the time has come to understand precisely what has been troubling Mr. Collins, and indeed, the entire village." She gestured subtly toward the empty chair near the table where she intended to demonstrate her findings. The villagers shifted, some leaning forward with mild anticipation, others exchanging quick, nervous glances. Miss Marple continued, her eyes sweeping across the group, pausing just long enough on each face to allow her words to sink in. You have all, in one way or another, observed Mr. Collins behaving unusually over the past week. He has been defensive, evasive, and occasionally frantic. But as often happens, behavior that seems inexplicable has a reason rooted in fear and caution rather than guilt. She allowed a small pause, letting the idea settle before continuing. Mr. Collins, perhaps you would allow us to see the object that has caused you so much concern? She said gently, nodding toward the small metal container that had been returned safely to his possession, retrieved earlier by the vicar after a careful search of the rose gardens. The villagers leaned in subtly, the air growing taut with curiosity. Collins hesitated, then carefully opened the container. Inside lay a bundle of letters and small documents tied neatly with a ribbon. Miss Marple pointed to the first letter, written in a delicate hand, and began to read aloud excerpts that explained the origin and importance of the container. It belonged to a distant relative, containing family secrets, minor inheritances, and most significantly, a record of debts and promises that could easily be misinterpreted if disclosed improperly. Collins had been right to protect it, but wrong in allowing his fear to control his interactions with others. As you can see, Miss Marple continued, the importance of this object is not in monetary value, but in the potential misunderstanding it could cause. Mr. Collins feared that if someone else discovered it, they might misuse its contents, leading to unnecessary scandal or hurt. She looked around at the villagers, allowing them to absorb the truth. At this, Mrs. Price Ridley's eyebrows lifted, and she exchanged a surprised glance with Colonel Halston. Mrs. Aldridge tilted her head, a faint smile appearing as relief replaced her earlier suspicion. The vicar nodded solemnly, clearly relieved that the mystery troubling his vicarage was at last explained. Miss Marple then addressed the small inconsistencies and apparent false leads that had caused so much confusion over the past days. The dirt in the vicar's study, the tracks near Mr. Collins' cottage, the whispers behind the rose garden, they all fit perfectly with the movements of those seeking to protect the container or observe Collins discreetly, not with any malicious intent. Each moment of panic or defensiveness was a response to fear, and each curious appearance by others was entirely coincidental. She paused and allowed the weight of her observation to settle. Even the so-called shadow seen in the corner, she said, her voice carrying just a hint of gentle humor, was nothing more than a play of light and the natural curiosity of those involved. Sometimes the mind creates phantoms where there are none, especially when one is already anxious or afraid. Mr. Collins, while careful, allowed his imagination to exaggerate the threat. Collins finally exhaled, visibly relaxing as he looked around at the assembly. Miss Marple, I feared I had caused alarm to everyone, he said quietly, almost ashamed. I did not intend to create suspicion or worry, only to protect something precious. And you did exactly the right thing in taking precautions, Miss Marple said warmly. Fear guided you, and that is natural. But the lesson, as always, is that careful observation and measured action prevent misunderstandings from growing into unnecessary drama. The villagers murmured agreement, some smiling gently. Colonel Halston patted Collins' shoulder, and Mrs. Aldridge offered a reassuring nod. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, who rarely allowed warmth to show in her expression, gave a subtle smile, the tension easing from her features. Miss Marple concluded the gathering with a few final words, allowing the village to embrace the sense of resolution. Let this be a reminder, she said softly, that mystery often lurks not in malice or wrongdoing, but in fear, misunderstanding, and secrecy. With patience, observation, and a gentle approach, even the most perplexing situations can be understood and harmony restored. The villagers nodded, understanding settling comfortably over them like a well-worn shawl. Collins carefully placed the container back in a secure spot, visibly more at ease now that the source of his anxiety had been explained, and the villagers shared a collective sigh of relief. Miss Marple smiled gently to herself, satisfied that the pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and confusing, had now been carefully assembled, revealing the clear picture beneath. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, bathing the vicarage garden in a soft golden glow, Miss Marple poured herself a final cup of tea, reflecting quietly on the day's revelations. The container was safe, the mystery solved, and the village once again returned to its comforting rhythm. Even in the midst of fear and confusion, reason, patience, and observation had guided them to clarity, proving once again that the most complex problems often yielded to careful, thoughtful consideration rather than haste or assumption. Chapter 10. Morning Tea and Quiet Reflection. The following morning, St. Mary Mead was bathed in the soft glow of early sunlight. Dew sparkled on the grass, and the village seemed almost to exhale in relief after the week's tension. Birds flitted through the hedgerows, their cheerful songs echoing across the lanes, while a gentle breeze carried the fragrance of blooming roses and freshly baked bread from the village baker. Miss Marple stepped out of her cozy cottage, a shawl draped comfortably across her shoulders, and made her way toward the vicarage for a morning cup of tea. There was a calm sense of purpose in her steps, a certainty that the recent turmoil had reached a peaceful conclusion. Inside the vicarage, the kitchen smelled warmly of toast and steeping tea. Mrs. Grimsley greeted her with a cheerful smile, as if the sun itself had been captured in her eyes. The table was set with delicate china, a small plate of scones, and a jug of steaming cream. The scene was the very picture of a quiet, comforting morning in St. Mary Mead, the kind of morning that reminded one why village life, with all its minor dramas, was so endearingly human. Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair by the window, allowing herself a moment to enjoy the tranquility. Mr. Collins arrived shortly afterward, his usual nervous energy now replaced by a calm relief. The container that had caused him so much anxiety the previous week sat safely in the corner of the room, its contents secured and intact. He poured himself a cup of tea with careful precision, pausing to inhale the rich aroma before sipping slowly. Miss Marple observed him with gentle satisfaction. Fear had guided his actions, yes, but now reason and clarity had restored balance. Colonel Halston entered with a nod and a warm smile, carrying a small newspaper that chronicled minor village events. Mrs. Aldridge followed, her presence serene, and Mrs. Price Ridley brought an assortment of freshly cut roses from her garden, placing them in a vase at the center of the table. The atmosphere was one of quiet camaraderie, the kind that only comes after shared experiences have been fully resolved. Miss Marple, taking in the scene, felt the comforting weight of resolution settle around her like a familiar shawl. As tea was poured and scones passed around, Miss Marple spoke first, her voice gentle yet carrying the soft authority of one accustomed to subtle leadership. "It is often the smallest details," she began, "that hold the greatest significance." Mr. Collins's recent anxiety was not without cause. The container he sought to protect carried family records and correspondences which, if misplaced or misunderstood, could have caused unnecessary distress. His vigilance, though sometimes frantic, was entirely justified. She paused, allowing each person to absorb the explanation, the words easing the lingering tension. Mr. Collins nodded, a faint blush warming his cheeks. "I feared that I had inconvenienced everyone," he admitted softly. "But Miss Marple's insight has shown me that my actions, though perhaps misunderstood, were prudent." "Exactly so," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "Fear often causes people to act in ways that seem irrational to others. But when observed carefully, even the most seemingly perplexing behavior can be understood in its proper context. There was no malice, only a desire to safeguard what is valued. Colonel Halston leaned back slightly, sipping his tea, and chuckled. It is remarkable, Miss Marple, how a little observation and patience can untangle even the most twisted of mysteries. I dare say the village owes you a debt of gratitude. Miss Marple smiled demurely, her hands folded neatly in her lap. I have only helped reveal what was already there, waiting to be seen. The village itself, with its ordinary rhythms and attentive eyes, provided many of the clues. One must only notice them with care. Mrs. Aldridge added quietly, It is a relief to know that nothing truly harmful was involved. Just misunderstandings and the natural caution of one concerned for the family's affairs. She glanced at Mr. Collins, who returned her gaze with a soft, grateful smile. Even Mrs. Price Ridley, usually stern and brisk, allowed a faint warmth to touch her expression. I admit, she said in her clipped manner, I was ready to assume the worst. But seeing the truth laid out so calmly, I realized that what seemed alarming was simply ordinary caution misunderstood. The conversation drifted to lighter topics, the village fete, the upcoming harvest festival, and the recent antics of the local children. Laughter began to fill the room, soft and genuine, lifting the last traces of anxiety from the week's events. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the ease returning to the village faces around her. Peace, she thought, was as much a part of St. Mary Mead as the hedgerows and cobblestone lanes. Once tea was finished, Miss Marple rose, folding her napkin neatly. Remember, she said gently, that understanding and patience often prevent the smallest fears from growing into unnecessary worry. The lessons of the past days need not be forgotten. Vigilance, yes, but also trust in one another. This is what keeps a community strong. Mr. Collins nodded earnestly. I shall remember that, Miss Marple. And I shall be more measured in my actions while still protecting what is important. His relief was palpable, a burden lifted at last from his shoulders. The villagers began to gather their things, ready to resume their day with hearts lightened. The sun, now climbing higher, filled the room with warmth, casting soft patterns across the polished table and the vase of roses. Miss Marple took one final sip of her tea, allowing herself a quiet smile. The mystery had been solved, the fears addressed, and the village restored to its gentle, comforting rhythm. As she stepped outside, she inhaled the fresh air deeply, savoring the scents of blooming flowers and warm earth. St. Mary Mead, with all its charm and peculiarities, was once again at peace. Children ran through the lanes, laughter ringing in the distance, and the sound of carts and chatter returned to the village square. Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that ordinary observation, gentle inquiry, and a thoughtful mind had resolved the week's unrest. She paused at the gate of the vicarage, glancing back at the friendly sunlit scene inside. The container, the secret, the tension. All had been laid bare, yet with no harm done, no scandal inflamed. It was the sort of resolution that reminded her why small villages with their ordinary lives could conceal extraordinary puzzles. And when those puzzles were solved carefully and kindly, the community itself emerged stronger, wiser, and more closely knit than before. With a final smile, Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, took up her walking stick, and began her slow stroll home. The village glowed in the soft morning light, the warmth on her face mirroring the quiet satisfaction in her heart. Mystery had visited St. Mary Mead, and mystery had departed, leaving behind only understanding, calm, and the gentle reminder that even in the most ordinary lives, vigilance, care, and observation could uncover the truth. As she disappeared down the lane, her figure bathed in sunlight, the village returned fully to its peaceful rhythm. Doors opened for neighbors, exchanging greetings. Children played near the fountain, and life in St. Mary Mead continued. Its charm intact, its mysteries remembered, but its community safe once more. Miss Marple, knitting bag in hand, walked onward with that serene confidence that came from knowing once again that even the most intricate puzzle could be solved with patience, kindness, and keen observation.